We're back in Genesis. And last week, we left off at chapter 37. So we're going to pick up in chapter 38. And as well, last time we said that the story shifts to the life of Joseph. And I even talked about how pretty much the rest of the book of Genesis is focused on the life of Joseph. And when we saw him last, he was 17 years old, right? His father had shown him favoritism, gave him that coat of many colors. And we also talked about how that didn't sit well with his brothers. They were jealous, right? And he had those dreams, and he shared the dreams with them. And, because of all of that, they wanted to kill him. And so they didn't kill him, but they decided, you know what, we'll make a little money off of it. We'll sell him into slavery. So they just happened to be a Midianite caravan passing by. They pulled him out of the pit that they threw him in, and they sold him into slavery. Now he was on his way to Egypt. And we talked about how even though he was in the midst of his trials, and those circumstances were as a result of sinful actions of his brothers, right? That he was directly in the center of God's will for his life, right? That he was exactly where God wanted him to be. And we're going to see that as we move along in our story. But even though I said that the rest of Genesis primarily is going to focus on Joseph, the first chapter we're going to come to, chapter 38, is actually kind of like a parenthesis in the story of the life of Joseph. And what we're going to focus on in this chapter is another son of Jacob, and that's Judah, right? And now there's some importance points to why we're focusing on this. Because first of all, we know Judah, a couple of things, right? His life, his story, it involves the lineage of Jesus, because he is through Judah, that's where the Messiah comes. So we're going to see some other points like that as well. So Genesis chapter 38, so if you have your Bibles, I trust you do, you can open to there. We're going to begin looking at verse 1, and it says, "It came to pass at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira." Now, we'll stop there because we're not really told exactly why Judah decided to separate from his brothers or from the rest of the family. Now, I have some speculations. I think, well, maybe could it have been his own guilt? Right, his own shame, the fact that, he convinced his brothers to sell his own brother Joseph into slavery, right? Sell him to the Midianites. Now, we're not told who Adullamite is, Hira, the Adullamite. He comes kind of into play a little bit here and there, but we're not told who he is. But he leaves, and it's for some time that he leaves his family. Look at verse 2. It says, "Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he married her and went into her." So he gets married. Now, he marries a Canaanite woman. Now, we know from the past, from other situations, that marrying into the women and the nations and the people around him was not a good thing for their family. And we're going to see a little bit of that as well, how that plays into it. But think about this. Judah, we talked about this in the past, by virtue of some of the actions that his older brothers, 3 older brothers, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, some of their actions, the birthright now has fallen to Judah, right? And so we're going to see some of the reactions or the actions, the consequences of Judah's action. But whether he realizes it or not, the responsibility of the line of the Messiah is through him, right? It's going to be through him. And so this passage is very interesting. It should be very interesting to us. But verse 3, it talks about their offsprings that they have, this when he marries this woman, Shua. It says, "She conceived and bore a son, and he called his name Er." I think that's interesting. I think that was an error, by...
An error?
An error. It could be E-R, I don't know, maybe that's his name. I don't know what to say. No. "She conceived again and bore another son and called his name Onan. And then she conceived yet again and bore a son and called his name Sheila. I don't know. That's not a great name for a guy. Maybe back in those days it didn't really mean anything. A boy named Sue, a boy named Sheila. I don't know. He was in Chezib, when she bore him. Now, it's interesting because they name these 3 sons, and none of these 3 sons will actually end up in the lineage of Jesus. None of them, right? We're going to see who does, but verse 6, it says, then Judah took, so he's here, he's been there for a while, right? Because it says, Judah now takes a wife for Er, his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Er, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him. So, they've been there for a while, wherever he was, away from his family, because his sons are now already grown up, and now they're getting wives for themselves. He gets a wife. Her name is Tamar, for his firstborn son. We're not even told where Tamar's from, to be honest with you. We're not told where she's from. But Er erred, obviously. And God didn't like whatever he did. It doesn't say what, but he was evil. He was wicked in the sight of the Lord. And God took care of him. Now, verse 8, because Er had no offsprings, it says, and Judah said to Onan, go into your brother's wife and marry her and raise up an heir to your brother. So an heir for Er, I'm going to keep saying that over and over again. You're going to be like, okay, fine, get her over with. Now, what's interesting, because this principle of when, a man dying and then his brother marries his wife and raises up an heir, it's obviously very similar to later down the line, they're going to get the Mosaic Law and they're going to have what's called a Levirate marriage, right? And so that's the idea of if a man dies and he has no offspring, that his brother or the nearest of kin would marry his widow, and then she would have children from him, and then that child would grow up to bear the name, if you will, of his dead, or the dead brother. He would also carry the birthright as well as the inheritance and so on. And so it's interesting, even though the law wouldn't be given for a few hundred years from this point in time, they still obviously had an idea that was very important to do that, to kind of carry along the lineage. So Er's brother Onan was next in line. Of course, Judah comes in, you have a responsibility, and he charges him, marry Tamar, raise up an heir for your brother. Problem, here it is, verse 9. But Onan knew that the heir would not be his, and it came to pass, when he went into his brother's wife, that he emitted on the ground, lest he should give an heir to his brother. And the thing which he did displeased the Lord, therefore he killed him also. So obviously Onan was like, listen, this heir that comes along, he's going to mess up my wealth, and we're going to get confused, and it's going to be like, well, what goes to this particular offspring, and what goes to my own offspring? So he's like, I don't want to have anything to do with this. So he kind of, falls short in his obedience, and God was displeased, and he takes care of him. So now, son number 2 down, right? So you got 2 down, you only got 1 more to go. 1 more son. Problem, right? Sheila, again, though a funny name for a boy, wasn't old enough to be married yet. Now, it's not told how old he was, but apparently maybe he was a teenager, younger. He just wasn't old enough. He wasn't ready yet. A few years away, a couple years, we're not told exactly. Verse 11, it says, then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till my son Sheila is grown. For he said, lest he also die like his brothers, like he does the wrong thing. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. So Judah's like, okay, I realize this is kind of like, 2 strikes, right? But we'll try the 3rd time. Maybe the 3rd time will be the charm, right? But wait, you're going to have to wait a little bit. You're going to have to wait some time. So he's telling her, right? You're going to have to wait. And she does. She waits. She goes to her father's house. She waits it out. Verse 12. Now, in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. And Judah was comforted and went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hira, the Adulamite. There he is again, whoever he is. And it was told Tamar, saying, look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she took off her widow's garments, covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself, and sat in an open place which was on the way to Timnah, for she saw that Sheila was grown, and she was not given to him as a wife. So however much time for Sheila to grow up had passed, right? And of course, it tells us that Judah's wife dies, and, she's probably not saying anything, because it's like, okay, he's in mourning. I want to wait. I want to be respectful. So she waits and she waits and she waits. And now he's out going to shear the sheep, and he's doing whatever. And they're like, hey, Judah's fine. Judah's all good and well, right? He's going out doing the work. He's not mourning anymore, right? So she's like, now what's the problem here? Sheila's all grown up. This is a problem, right? Tamar here is going to take matters into her own hands. Now, right or wrong, and probably definitely on the wrong side of the action, road here. But she was going to have an heir to receive what was rightfully due her, because you have to understand, in their day and age, in that culture, a woman didn't get anything regarding an inheritance. So it was strictly up to the husband, whatever he received from his inheritance, to take care of his wife, to take care of his family. So now if a woman dies, if a woman's husband dies, and especially if she has no children, right, then she has no means of supporting herself. She is basically destined for poverty and for homelessness. And even beyond that, just kind of an outcast, shunned by the society, because she has nothing to take care of herself. And then so what happens is she puts off her garments of mourning, and she puts on a veil. Now that veil, very clearly, and you'll see how it plays out, but that veil speaks of a veil that a prostitute would wear, right? So it wasn't a coincidence what happens next, right? Because two ways about this. Tamar was kind of making a plan. She was going to entrap her father-in-law, and she was going to be like, I'm going to get an heir one way or another, right? Now, as well, rightfully in her mind, she was still bound to Judah and to his family, right? She was still considered his daughter-in-law because he had told her, do this, right? And she said, I'm going to submit to that, and I'm going to go and do what you've asked me to do. So she put herself under the authority, under the care of Judah. And there was no sign in her mind of Judah fulfilling his responsibility. So we see what happens, right? Verse 15. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, but because she had covered her face. Then he turned to her by the way and said, please let me come in to you, for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. So she said, what will you give me that you may come in to me? And he said, I will send a young goat from the flock. And she said, well, will you give me a pledge till you send it? In other words, he didn't have a young goat with him. So she's like, well, how do I know you're going to give me that? Give me some sort of a pledge, like a kind of deposit, if you will, And he said, well, I will. What pledge shall I give you? She said, well, how about your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand? Then he gave them to her and went in, and she conceived by him. And she arose and went away and laid aside her veil and put on her garments of widowhood. So, at this point, we'll stop there. Tamar, they depart. They leave each other. She's still holding on to Judah's signet, right? Now, a signet would be kind of either a ring or some kind of like a piece of gold or something that had like a pattern on it. And they would use that when they were sealing documents. They would put wax on like envelopes to seal it, and they would use their signet to kind of put a seal. That would tell you exactly whose that seal was. It belonged strictly and only to Judah, right? So she had that, and the cord would have been whatever it was attached to. And then, of course, the staff, he was a shepherd, and so he would have had a shepherd's staff. So she has these things. Now, very significant for her to have these particular items, because they would have easily been identifiable who they belonged to, right? So her plan, her initial plan, is successful. She becomes pregnant, right? So we move on, verse 20. And Judah sent the young goat by the hand of his friend the Adulamite, there's Hira again, to receive his pledge from the woman's hand. And he didn't find her. Then he asked the men of that place, Hira was going, well, where's the harlot who was openly by the roadside? And they said, there was no harlot in this place. So he returned to Judah and said, I cannot find her. Also, the men of the place said there was no harlot in that place. Now understand, Tamar was not about a goat. She didn't care about the goat, right? She got just exactly what she wanted. She got the items that would identify Judah, But then she also got pregnant, which is also what she wanted. So she got what she wanted, and she was off, right? Verse 23, then Judah said, let her take from them for herself, lest we be shamed. For I sent this young goat, and you have not found her. So in essence, Judas is basically like, well, we tried, right? We tried. She's got my signet. She's got, the staff. What are we going to do about that, right? Let's just move on. Not so fast. Verse 24, it came to pass about 3 months after, starting to show, right? She's Tamar, that Judah was told, saying, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot. Furthermore, she is with child by harlotry. So Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. Like Judah, like oblivious to the circumstance and what he has done, he's like indignant. Like, oh, how can my daughter-in-law, she's supposed to be faithful and, and so on. And, and he is consumed. So he's going down to the square or wherever they administer justice. He's thinking, I'm bringing justice to this situation. She has shamed our family, and she's gonna really get it. And you know what? He was in store for a rude awakening, right? Judah, So verse 25 says, when she was brought out, so they're gonna administer justice. She said to her father-in-law, saying, but the man to whom these belong, I am with child. And she said, please, look at them. Please determine who these are, the signet and cord and staff. I'm sure as she was saying the words, the sound in the background, the soundtrack was dun, dun, dun. Like Judah's heart was sinking, right? Like a bad telenovela, the Mexican soap operas. You guys know what those are? Anyway, it's like this is the scene, right? And Judah knows, man, I'm on the hot seat. Like, I am sunk. I am found out. And he responds appropriately, I guess you could say. Judah acknowledged them. Yeah, they're mine. And said, she has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah, my son. Right? He knew he was wrong. He knew he was holding back his son for whatever reason. And he was wrong. And then it says, and he never knew her again. So it didn't happen again. It wasn't like, oh, I'm in love with my daughter-in-law. No, it was just a situation. But he knew he was wrong. Now, it's interesting because as carnal as that whole situation was, what's really fascinating is Tamar and her son, Perez, we'll see Perez in just a moment, they're actually in the lineage of Jesus Christ. They're in the lineage. In fact, when you look at Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, there are 5 women mentioned, right? Usually with genealogies, men are not mentioned. Men, it's like maybe it might have a little mention here or there, but rarely are women even considered important enough to be mentioned. It's always, father to son, and then son to father, father to son, and keep going on begetting all the begots and stuff. But in this case, with Jesus, we have 5. First, you have Tamar, right? And of course, we know Tamar played the harlot, played the prostitute. The next one, you have Rahab. Right? Rahab was in Jericho. She was a prostitute, right? And she helped the spies, and of course, she ends up marrying the father of Boaz. And then we have Boaz, who marries Ruth, right? She was a Moabitess, but she marries Boaz. And then you also have Bathsheba. And we know how Bathsheba and David got together. It was an affair, right? Forced upon her, if you will, whatever. Ends up killing her husband, putting him in the front lines. And then, of course, the last one is Mary. And though Mary is righteous by society, she was seen as an unwed, pregnant teenager. Even though it was a miraculous conception, it was still scandalous to those around them. So you think about all the women that God added into the genealogy of Jesus Christ, right? A lot of sordid pasts or kind of life issues. None of them, if you will, ultimately squeaky clean, as it were, at least seen as. So what's the significance of that? Why would God allow or put all those particular people in the genealogy of Jesus? Well, you could say, definitely you could say that God providentially had these women in the genealogy to show that the Messiah, his lineage, if you will, represented all walks of life, right? That the people that he came from, he wasn't like from, blue bloods and special, like, oh, they're pristine lineage. No, his lineage was filled with scandal and all kinds of stuff. He had righteous and he had not so righteous, right? And it also shows us that the gospel, it's exactly what we've been talking about on Sunday evenings. The gospel, we call it, the gospel of Luke, we call it humanity. That the gospel is for all humanity, right? In Christ, within Christ, he takes care of, he welcomes in all those, whatever the background is, whatever we have in life, the hardships, the wrongs, the sinfulness, all of that in Christ is received and is covered by the blood of Christ. That's a great picture we have here with this woman and with the genealogy of Christ. Now, verse 27, as we move along, it came to pass, and now it's time to give birth. It says that, behold, twins were in her womb. And so it was when she was giving birth that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread and bound it on his hand, saying, this one came out first. Then it happened, as he drew back his hand, that his brother came out unexpectedly. And she said, how did you break through? This breach be upon you. Therefore his name was called Perez, which actually means breach or breakthrough. After this, his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. Now, first off, you have to just go, they had some really bizarre births and deliveries in the Bible. Like hands coming out. It was like aliens or something, I don't know exactly. But it was just bizarre, right? And that's obviously where we get the term breach baby, from this particular moment. But as well, that scarlet thread, that's very important. Because there's a thematic idea of a scarlet thread woven within the Old Testament. That scarlet thread will speak of the blood of Christ and the plan of salvation through Jesus Christ, all the way from the beginning, from Genesis, the creation, all the way to Christ himself, right? And yet here in this moment, they put the scarlet thread on the wrong baby, right? They put the scarlet thread on the secondborn. And we know through the lineage of Jesus Christ that Perez is the one that the lineage goes through. So what can we say here? Well, you can say this in a way, in a sense, in a very real sense, represents the blindness of man when it comes to the Messiah. In other words, when it comes to the Messiah, they missed it. The Jews will miss it. Think about it. That's true, right? The one they think it is ends up being not the one it is, right? They miss. And in fact, actually, if you think about it, the first one, right, Perez comes out. The first one, they think, well, the hand sticks out. They think, oh, that's the Messiah. That's the one, the scarlet thread. That's the first point. Pulls it back in, and Perez comes out, and they miss it. So in other words, the first one, Jesus, was really the Messiah. They missed it. They think it wasn't Jesus. Now they're looking for the second one. And they think the second one is going to be the Messiah. And we know, who's the second one going to be? The second one is going to be the Antichrist. And they're going to get it wrong. They're going to get it wrong. So this kind of represents that type of a scene. They got the first one wrong. They're looking for the second one. That's not the right one. Now, we get back to Joseph, because now we kind of move from this story that happens with Judah, and the story then shifts back to Joseph. Excuse me. Did I say Joseph? Judah, back to Joseph. So chapter 39, we'll get through this. Joseph, verse 1 says, had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. So Joseph, we see back to Joseph again. He's in Egypt, right? He's under the ownership as a slave of a man by the name of Potiphar. Now Potiphar, it tells us something about him. He's an officer of Pharaoh. He's a captain of the guard. Now interesting, because that word guard in the Hebrew means executioner or slaughterer. He was the captain of the slaughterers, right? Of the executioners. Listen, which tells us this is one guy you do not want to get on his bad side, right? He has means, he has authority, right? To wipe out people, right? To take them out, cut them off, right? The captain of the executioners. So you don't want to mess around with him. Now, at first, was not something that Joseph, at least seemingly, would have to worry about. Because you can look at verse 2. It says, the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. And then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. Wow, that's amazing, right? Because Joseph is a slave, right? But it tells us that God was with Joseph. If you remember how Joseph must have felt, right? Remember he was put in that pit, right? And that he was sold into slavery and all that happened to him. And you thought, well, he must have felt abandoned. He must have felt like all alone. But then we see here, this verse, the Lord was with Joseph. So in other words, somehow God reminded Joseph that he was going to be with him. That he wasn't alone, that he was with him. In fact, so much so, because think about this. It wasn't just like, oh, the Lord was with him, and Joseph knew in his heart, right, that the Lord was with him. No, what was happening with Joseph was very, very evident. So much so that Potiphar, right, this captain of the guard, this captain of the slaughterers, right? This Egyptian, because the Egyptians looked down on every other group, every other ethnic group, every other country, peoples. They thought, we're the Egyptians. We're the pinnacle of humanity, of all humans. We're it, right? And so if you were anyone else, and especially a slave, you were nothing. So for Potiphar to actually recognize something about Joseph, it must have been happening amazingly. Oh, hey, he touched something and it, I don't know, turns to gold or something. That sounds kind of funny, but something must have been happening that caused Potiphar to go, wow, the Lord is with Joseph, right? He's with Joseph. Verse 5 says, so Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hands, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. And then it says, now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. So you think about Joseph, a slave, right? Potiphar gives Joseph all of this responsibility. A slave. So something really must have been going on with Joseph. He got so blessed. Potiphar was so blessed. It was like, I don't even have to worry about it anymore. I don't even have to think about anything. Joseph's taking care of it, and I am it's like abundance, right? I just eat. I just go do what I need to do, and it's all there for me, right? Just soak it in the benefits. Now, I think that last sentence in verse 6 is very interesting because it says, Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And I kind of like he was a hottie with the body. You know what I mean? Maybe not. Oh. He was obviously he was good looking. He was physique and so on and so forth. He was a young man. Who knows exactly how old he was here? Maybe around 20, 22, somewhere around there at this point. We're not told exactly, but he was just a charismatic person. It tells us he was a successful man. So even the things he would say and then do, it would just hey, that's right. That sounds really good. That works out really well, right? And it works out especially for Potiphar. So people would have been naturally attracted to him as a person. Now, again, though, he was still a slave. He was still a slave, even though he may have been a steward, because a steward had responsibility for his master's goods, but he was still a slave, right? But think about this, because that, again, we talk about Joseph becoming a type of Christ. Philippians 2:7 talks about Jesus making himself of no reputation, taking on the form of a bondservant, a slave, and coming in the likeness of man. So, Joseph is that type of Christ once again. Unfortunately, Joseph's charisma, his good looks, We're going to get him in a little bit of a sticky situation. As we move along, verse 7, and it came to pass after these things that the master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, lie with me, lie with me. You can imagine, right? She's an Egyptian woman. So she's just batting those long, fake Egyptian eyelashes at him, like, lie with me, and think about Potiphar's wife. She would have been somebody like, very influential or affluent, right? She would have had all the latest, whatever, clothing, makeup, perfume, whatever it was, whatever Egyptian fashion was on at that time, that would have been Potiphar's wife. And she was probably used to pretty much just getting whatever she wanted, right? Whatever she wanted. And at this point right now, she wanted Joseph, right? She wanted the golden boy. She wanted him as like a trophy, right? I got to set my sights on that trophy, and I'm going to bag me a Joseph kind of a thing. But here we see through the forging pressures of the trials that Joseph has already experienced. Remember, Joseph was that guy, that young 17-year-old who had the coat of many colors, walking along in the desert, wearing his coat, telling his brothers and his dads, I got this dream, you're all going to bow down to me, Maybe true, but maybe also a little bit arrogant or a little haughty, a little bit, just not wise at least, as far as sharing those stories. But at this point, going through all that he's gone through, the pressures and the crucible of trials, God has now produced a young man with character and integrity. In fact, Joseph was a man with wisdom, right? He realizes the kind of man Potiphar was. That any slip, any stepping out of bounds here could potentially be disastrous for him. I mean, think about Joseph. He's probably like, I'm a slave. I got it pretty good right now. If I do something stupid, it's going to mess that up, right? It's going to jeopardize all of that. But even beyond just what he has and the benefits that he has and the good things that he has, through all of what Joseph has endured, he obviously has drawn close to God. I mean, if you think about Joseph being carted from Canaan all the way to Egypt, he had a lot of time to pray. A lot of time to seek God and go, God, why is this happening? I thought you gave me this dream, and I don't even know what that even means, and why now, what's going on? He had a lot of time to pray. And so through all of that, through his time to pray, through the trials, right, we see a character forged, right? A man of integrity shining forth. Look at verse 8. But he refused and said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Again, Joseph is a wise man. He's speaking wisdom here. Right? He's telling her, listen, I understand I have this authority, or I have this responsibility. Your husband has given me all of this. He doesn't know. He entrusts me. He's given me his trust, right? With everything that he has, except for you, because you're his wife. That's beyond my scope of authority here, right? I'm not going to step beyond that, right? I can't do this great wickedness. Look, and he says, and sin against God. And the truth is, when we step out of God's word, when we step away from God's best, maybe we sin against others, and that is true, but we not only sin against others, but ultimately we sin against God. We know David said those same words. Remember, after his sin with Bathsheba, Nathan comes to him and exposes his sin in Psalm 51:4. He says, against you and you only have I sinned, right? When we sin, ultimately, we sin against the God who created us, right? Our creator. So Joseph here is showing his faith, that his faith has been forged in the fires of adversity. Now, he's going to need that faith. He's going to need that faith because Potiphar's wife wasn't going to take no for an answer. She was not. Look at verse 10. So it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day, every day, all the time, that he did not heed her. He resisted day after day after day to lie with her or to be with her. So she was relentless. And listen, it tells me, it speaks to me of how Satan is, right, with us. Satan and his attacks and his temptations are relentless, right? The enemy never takes a break. The enemy doesn't take a holiday. He's always on the prowl. He's always looking for opportunities to pounce, opportunities to trip us up, right, to get us, taken down. Now, we're going to see in this story that he kind of finds one. The enemy finds one here with Joseph, at least to make accusation. Verse 11. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside. I want to stop right there because that's a very, very important thing that we see. Because I think in one sense, there was a little bit of a slip of judgment on the part of Joseph. Listen, he should have done whatever he could to never, ever be alone with this woman, to never allow himself to be alone. And I would just say this, it's a great rule of thumb for us as Christians. We should limit the moments that we are alone with the opposite sex. I know that sounds like, I'm a prude or whatever, but there are several reasons. First, if it's someone that you are attracted to, then you're going to be open to the possibility of temptation for yourself, right? And especially if there's no one else around, if you're alone, it's going to be a lot easier for things to happen, right? So we can't allow ourselves to be caught up in a moment like that. So we need to be smart. We need to be proactive. We need to be keeping ourselves, right? And listen, it doesn't matter if they think you're weird or they look at you like, why are you so prudish or whatever. Better to do that or have them think that than to stumble and to sin against the Lord. Now, that's the first thing. But second thing, that may be on you, right? Your own temptations, but you also may cause someone else to stumble. Right? So it's not just about yourself, it's about the other person. That what you're allowing them to think or how they might have feelings, and you just don't want them to be put into that position. That's not loving, that's not caring for that other person. And then thirdly, you open the door to potential accusations. Look, we see it exactly in this situation with Joseph. He didn't do anything wrong, but there's an accusation made by Potiphar's wife. So people will lie about you, right? Whether it's true or not. If you give them that opportunity, they'll bring accusation against you. They'll tell others. They'll talk about you. They'll gossip. They'll slander. They'll do whatever, right? Maybe especially because they're upset because you refuse their advances, like we see here. Proverbs 22:1 tells us a good name, in other words, a good reputation, is to be chosen rather than great riches. And I would just say this, a good name ruined is very difficult to get back. Absolutely. Colossians 1:22 calls us to be above reproach. Now, what does that even mean? That's a 50-cent word or 50-pence word. It's a big word. Like, what is above reproach? Just means that we should not allow anything blaringly obvious, negatively speaking, in our lives that someone else can grab onto and bring an accusation against us. There shouldn't be anything hanging off our lives. We're doing things in such a way that they can go, aha, yeah, you call yourself a Christian, what is this? And you go, I can't deny that. I mean, at least not fully, because you've allowed yourself to be, to have that in your life, right? 1 Thessalonians 5:22 states, abstain from all appearance of evil. That means even if it just looks not good, we should be wise enough to go, I'm not going to do that. I need to stay away from that because people might get the wrong idea, right? So that's the idea. I mean, and not all the time can we be perfectly in that, but we should be walking in wisdom, right? Walking in wisdom. And so Joseph, in a sense, slip of a little bit of judgment, steps into the house. No one else is there. He didn't, and not good what proceeds. But verse 12, she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me, right? He's got nowhere else to go. And so he says, but he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. Now, Joseph, he did the right thing, right? This woman was not going to be denied. So Joseph, he has nowhere else to go. And the idea here, it says fled. It's like basically he ran out either naked or half naked. I mean, he just pulled himself out, right? That reminds me of 2 Timothy 2:22. It says, flee youthful lusts. Mm-hmm. Listen, God provides a way of escape. It's called run. Run away, whatever it takes, right? I think of that verse where Jesus says, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. Or if your foot offends you, cut it off. For it's better to go into eternity maimed than to be whole, in eternal judgment, right? The idea here is what you might call spiritual radical amputation. Whatever it takes, right, to keep yourself, right? Sometimes it can look really weird, look really funny. I remember a gentleman telling a story. He was overcoming pornography addictions, and he decided when he had to travel for business, and so he goes to hotels, and you got a TV in the room, and what does the TV have on there? It has the internet, or it has a cable, and it has channels, and you're alone, and no one's stopping you, and you can just watch whatever. And he realizes, I don't want to have to be put in that position and that temptation. So what does he do? He calls the hotel, and he says, I'm checking in on such and such a day. I would like the TV removed from my room. And they look at him really, really weird, right? But he doesn't care if they look at him weird. What does it matter what those people think? Mm-hmm. He just cares what God thinks about him and what he has done before God. So he's going to radically amputate that situation in his life. That's the idea, right? Whatever it takes. So Joseph runs. Now, he's running out of this house kind of half naked or naked or whatever. Obviously, people are seeing him, getting the wrong impression, no doubt. Look at verse 13. So it was when she saw that he left his garment in her hand and fled outside. Now she concocts another plan. She called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, see, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. Right? Where they say hell has no fury like a woman scorned. He rebuffed her advances. She's now got an opportunity. No one knows what really happened because there was no one else there. They see him running out naked or half naked or whatever. They don't know exactly. Now she dictates the narrative, right? She says what she says, right? And if she can't have him, by golly, she is going to destroy him. That's what her plan is. So she tells him. And she even uses their prejudice against the Hebrews, right? She says, he brought a Hebrew into the house. Like, take advantage of their own, prejudice against other types of ethnic groups. Verse 16, so she kept his garment with her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with the words like these, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to me to mock me. So it happened as I lifted my voice and cried out that he left his garment with me and fled outside. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, and a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. So she lies again about Joseph to her husband. Now, it's interesting because, Potiphar knows that the blessings of God were on Joseph and it was benefiting his life. So what is going to trump that, right? Oh, it's his hatred for other groups, right? The Egyptians saw themselves as the pinnacle of humanity. These are just lowly Egyptians, Hebrews. They're lowly Hebrews. They're not even lowly Hebrews. They're lowly Hebrew slaves. He was a slave. So it's like, now that overrides his sense of like what Joseph brought as a blessing. And now, Joseph, because he was a slave, there was no trial, there was no inquiry, there was no questioning, right? He was just thrown into prison. Now, it says the king's prison. Now, I don't want you to get the idea like as if, that's the luxurious prison. That's where they have the comfy pillows and the, and all that, the quilts so they don't get cold, like that. No, not at all. In fact, this was the place where the king would send people he really had it in for, right? The king's prison. This is like, we're going to get you and we're going to put you in that, right? And that's where Joseph was. As a dungeon. It was terrible. But here's the thing. Joseph could have said, thanks a lot, Lord. Thanks, man. I stand up for you. I even resist this woman. And this is the thanks I get, right? This is what I get for all of my integrity, my standing up for you. But you never hear that from Joseph, right? You never hear that. In fact, Joseph's refusal to sin with Potiphar's wife is, again, another picture of Jesus. Hebrews 4:15 says that Jesus was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. So he serves as that. And Joseph as well, he could have been discouraged, right? Oh my gosh, it's getting worse. I had it okay as a slave. Now I'm in prison, And yet look at verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Now, it doesn't tell us exactly how, but that verse is there to say that God, even in the midst of all that situation, was able to encourage Joseph. Like, I know it looks bad, Joseph, but it's okay. It's okay, Joseph. And I'm still here. I am still with you. Listen, we need to know that. When we're in the midst of trials, when we think, God, why have you allowed this? It seems like it's not even going from bad to bad. It's going from bad to worse. It's not getting better. It's getting worse. We need to know that God is still with us. We need to remember verses like Hebrews 13:5, where it says, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Somehow God was with Joseph, right? In fact, verse 22 and 23, our last couple verses, and the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing, Joseph's. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him, with Joseph. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. Sound familiar? It was the exact same words, basically, that with Potiphar. The same situation was happening here. Looked like a worse situation, right? But God, even in the seemingly terrible situation, blesses and works with Joseph. And people recognize it. They see, whoa, something's going on with this young man here. Wow. I mean, for him, the keeper of the prison, he's not even just a slave anymore. He's a prisoner. Could you imagine this? Like the warden going, all right, whatever, prisoner, Joseph, you're a prisoner here. You're in for life or whatever. Take control, run the whole operations, and we're not talking like gangs running the whole operation. We're talking about a guy that has integrity and blessings upon his life. So God was still doing something. Now listen, there's many more years in the crucible ahead for Joseph. There still is. But through this situation, God is showing Joseph, he's showing us that he is still in control. Right? He's still in control. And so as we look at Joseph and we continue to look as we see the rest of these chapters, we need to not be discouraged. We may be in the crucible right now. We may feel like, things are really bad or things aren't going really well. We're serving the Lord. We're living for the Lord. We're seeking be right for God, and look at what we get for it, And yet through the crucible, as we've said time and time again, our faith will shine forth as gold. So let's pray.